Welcome to New Orleans, the home of the Mardi Gras. Now, everybody knows what Mardi Gras is like. But here in New Orleans, people know that there are many different sides to the Mardi Gras. Similarly, we all know what happened to New Orleans on August 29th, 2005. Katrina.
The biggest natural disaster in
Katrina was a natural disaster.
A major American city went through a natural disaster.
Unlike Katrina, where you had a natural disaster.
Katrina, the hurricane, did so much damage in New Orleans.
This natural disaster befell New Orleans.
And yes, it's true, the Mississippi Gulf Coast did suffer devastating damage from a hurricane that day. But as a part-time resident of New Orleans, I became aware over the weeks and months that followed the flood, as did everybody else here, that there was a very different side to that story. And that's the side you're about to see. Aside from the occasional oil slick, New Orleans is enjoying a remarkable recovery right about now. But it's not hard when you see that familiar shape forming in the Gulf of Mexico on the weather maps or watch a certain TV program for the memories to come flooding back for a lot of us. It's amazing, even to New Orleanians, how big a part of this area flooded and how fast.
At 4:30 in the morning, an hour and a half before Katrina made landfall, the first two breaches occurred in the levee system down at the CSX Railroad on either side of the Industrial Canal. That's the bridge in the distance, initiating the flooding of Greater New Orleans. St. Bernard Parish experienced the worst flooding at 5:30 in the morning. Watch how that front of water just shoots in. This flooded in the space of 3 hours.
The water came from the intersection of the Intercoastal Waterway and Mr. Go, and it came down here and into the Industrial Canal and then over the top of the flood wall in the Industrial Canal and into the lower Ninth Ward.
At 6:30 a.m., a large section of the 17th Street Canal flood wall began breaching, a process that continued for the next 2 hours. It literally slid 60 feet backwards and collapsed.
As a result, a 10-foot wall of water was shot into the city, destroying many of the houses in the immediate vicinity of the breach. At 7:45 in the morning, just as the surge was peaking in this canal, two massive breaches occurred in the flood wall behind me, sending an 18-foot high wall of water into the lower Ninth Ward.
It was instantaneous. The water came in there, it piled up, it got so high it came over the top, it carved this gap behind the flood wall along the Industrial Canal, and eventually wound up shoving it aside like a battalion of bulldozers.
Totally destroying the first 5 rows of homes, and even some homes 9 blocks back were floated off their foundations. It's here that we had the greatest number of people killed due to drowning during Katrina. At 8:15 a.m., the embankment at the foot of the Orleans Canal is overtopped and floods City Park for about 3 hours.
At 8:30, a 1-mile stretch of levee behind the lakefront airport that's 2 feet lower than the adjacent earthen levee is overtopped with surge coming from Lake Pontchartrain. The flooding lasts for about 3 hours.
At 9 a.m., the storm surge from Lake Pontchartrain peaks in the 3 drainage canals in the Orleans Metro Bowl with no overtopping of the lakefront levees. At 9:30 a.m., the breach here in the London Avenue at Miraboo occurred. You can see it's marked here by the white rocks. The flood wall fell into a huge hole that had been scoured out behind it, sending a wall of water about 12 foot high into the homes, totally destroying the first line of homes and adding to the catastrophic flooding of this part of Greater New Orleans.
The London Avenue Canal breached and the entire neighborhood flooded, between 11 and 13 feet of water.
That straight ahead is the London Outfall Canal. Over there is the greatest break of the levee. Now, there's a huge chunk of concrete. You can imagine the force that blew away concrete. If we had to go downstairs to that front door to try to get out, I can't swim a lake.
At 10:30 in the morning, the last of the major breaches in the New Orleans levee system occurred here, this area that's marked by the white rocks and the shiny new wall. And these floodwaters then flowed into the areas that were already flooding from the 17th Street Canal, ensuring the total devastation of this portion of New Orleans. You can see how these fronts of water just expand and join up with each other. Now, what's very important is there's some natural ridges in the city, and that held up the water from coming into the main downtown area until the late afternoon. Now you will see the water really starts to run, and that's when we were hearing about whitewater rapids on the street. So this model run here just shows you how we sunk Orleans Parish, a large part of New Orleans, in 24 hours. I had started to realize in the early 1990s that New Orleans was super susceptible to being drowned by a hurricane, by the surge associated with a major hurricane.
Dr. Ivor Van Heerden was born in South Africa. At the time of Katrina, he was the deputy director of the LSU Hurricane Center, which he co-founded, and also director of the Center for the Study of the Public Health Impacts of Hurricanes.
And so I went after the research dollars so that we could better understand what the consequences would be for New Orleans and southeast Louisiana of major hurricane landfall. And as part of trying to understand the surge dynamics, we acquired a storm surge model, which we then modified to work for our coast. And by the time Hurricane Katrina arrived, we had this model running in operational support to the state of Louisiana.
I think I was carrying some extra baggage that had been left over from 40 years earlier.
Dr. Bob B. is professor of civil and environmental engineering at the University of California, Berkeley. He began his career in the 1950s working for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers.
Katrina was repeating something that we had experienced as a family earlier called Hurricane Betsy. We lost all of our belongings, including wedding photographs. I had to swim back into our home to start the salvage. So hearing these early reports of water now in the French Quarter, I knew instinctively that large areas of the city had been disastrously flooded.
We know that Katrina was about a 1 in 30 to 1 in 40 year storm.
In fact, New Orleans proper likely experienced only Category 1 or Category 2 conditions.
This is contrary to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, who are trying to claim that Katrina was a
1 in 496 probability of occurrence. The Army Corps generals came out in their green suits and immediately said that
that was a big storm.
The reason they're doing that is to cover their behinds.
And you can't out-engineer Mother Nature.
Part of their defense was this was a humongous storm.
Katrina was a storm that was, until then, unimaginable.
And they seemed to know what they were talking about, so everybody started picking on FEMA instead.
I had spent the last 3 decades studying very, very large accidents and catastrophes. So with the foreknowledge I had of this one, I thought, well, this seems the start of the largest disaster involving civil engineered systems in the history of the United States.
I was at the State Emergency Operations Center, and that was around 8 o'clock on Monday evening. And quite honestly, it was, at that time, everybody was congratulating themselves that we had dodged the bullet. And we first heard of a nursing home somewhere that had 2 feet of water in it, and the water was rising 1/2 foot an hour. They weren't sure where it was, and they weren't sure if it was salt or fresh water, which would have been the key. As far as I know, they lost telephone contact. It became very clear to me Tuesday night that what happened at 17th Street and London Avenue, those breaches hadn't occurred because the water had overtopped the levees. And I went to the governor's office on Tuesday night and said, I don't believe these levees failed because of the surge. And their response to me was, go find out. On the Sunday, a week after landfall, I flew most of the levee systems and counted at that time 28 sites where there had been breaching. I videotaped this. I wanted them to understand exactly what I had seen, that this catastrophic flooding represented multiple breaches beyond the 3 that were being discussed in the media. 2 weeks later, we started to create the official state investigative team known as Team Louisiana.
Boy, there's some shit piled up here. I mean, big.
On our first visit,
14-year-old concrete work.
September the 29th, my colleague, Professor Ray Seed, who's one of the world's authorities in soil mechanics, he zoomed in very quickly on the soil. In my case, I paid a great deal of attention early in those days to the people, the organizational aspects of this disaster.
The 2 teams of investigators were literally digging up the secrets of the past, but someone else was tackling the future.
I had deployed to New Orleans to work specifically on the pumps.
Maria Garzino, a civil and mechanical engineer from the Los Angeles office of the Army Corps of Engineers, was flying into New Orleans to supervise the testing and installation of the new pumping system.
In the event of a storm coming in, the gates at these interim closure structures would drop and prevent any possible surge from Lake Pontchartrain entering back into the canals or possibly into the city. These pumps are critical. They take rainfall from the storm event and they evacuate it from the canal and pump it into Lake Pontchartrain. The testing did not go very well.
I put together a group of 6 engineers and scientists. And then we also contracted with 3 retired geotechnical engineers. We could supply the academic component, they could supply the real-world, hands-on experience component, and in that way we would have a very, very complete team.
I returned 3 weeks later. Ray Seed had returned a week before me.
Like his colleague Bob B., Dr. Ray Seed is a professor of engineering at the University of California, Berkeley. He didn't want to talk to us for this film, but in 2007 he wrote a 17-page letter outlining many of his thoughts and observations about what had been going on during the investigation.
What we have seen these past 2 years has been a significant and still ongoing effort to promulgate misleading studies and statements, to subvert appropriate independent investigations that would provide useful second opinions, and to literally attempt to change some of the critical apparent answers regarding lessons to be learned in the wake of this major disaster.
We had 35 people that were on our team.
There's a number of things that we're evaluating. This is just one.
Coming and going from New Orleans at different time frames. The National Science Foundation sponsors us to the tune of approximately $300,000.
Very early in the process, the Corps of Engineers announced that they were going to do their own study.
The Interagency Performance Evaluation Team, IPET, was comprised of multiple federal agencies and consultants and researchers from universities and other institutions to demonstrate that it was not the Corps investigating itself, but it was, of course, really the Corps investigating itself with the help of its own selected consultants.
Whereas we only had a little over $100,000, they were going to have $23 to $26 million.
There would be no consideration or study of organizational issues, political issues, funding issues, human factors. The mantra was repeatedly espoused that the investigation would look only forward. There would be no looking back and no consideration of fault or blame.
None of our investigation members received any salary for this work.
We could never have afforded to hire these guys, risking their own careers uphill against the federal pressures, which were enormous at some times, to do the right thing because it was necessary and because somebody had to do it.
Additional money came from our wise charge cards.
We would have one team that was doing the drilling of the boreholes and doing the cone penetrometer and seismic work.
26.
I love to dig in soil. I love to taste soil that way that you can sense soil. You taste it first to see how gritty it feels between your teeth. If it's very, very gritty, it tells you there's a lot of sand in the soil. If it's not that much gritty, it's probably much more silty.
We climbed up into some of the buildings and we could very distinctly find the high water marks. We were collecting data such as stop clocks to allow us to interpret when the levees breached, at what time each breach occurred, and how quickly the water level rose. We were doing geotechnical investigations, and we were doing seismic surveys to investigate how deep the sheet pile was buried beneath the system.
The American Society of Civil Engineers and the National Science Foundation field teams immediately realized the vast scope of ground that needed to be covered and the tremendous urgency as data was disappearing daily. Data and initial observations not gathered in those first precious 2.5 weeks in the field would be gone forever.
When I was in Florida at the manufacturer's testing facility, the pumps themselves were not holding up to that testing. They were, for lack of a better term, self-destructing. Instead of actually determining what was going wrong, the pump manufacturer was simply taking off the part that failed, replacing it, and asking for and receiving a lesser testing requirement. Essentially, instead of running it at full operating speeds and pressures, running it at lesser than. In other words, it normally would run at around 3,200 psi. Now we're going to run it at 2,500 psi, and that was in the hopes that it would hold together long enough to get through that testing phase. There was little done on the contractor's part to explain why were these failures happening. O-ring seal failures, high pressure line failures, vibrations, excessive vibrations, high heat, all of these things catastrophic.
When we first arrived in New Orleans, it was essentially pretty miserable because we were struggling to understand this very complex problem.
It tells us the wall fell first.
The failure and the catastrophes.
The water starts rushing in.
Meanwhile, struggling with basic life, I'll call it sustenance and survival. This was a tough time.
We'll follow the course of the investigations, but first...
Welcome to Ask a New Orleanian. Why are New Orleanians sitting on their asses waiting for the federal government to repair their city?
Well, the thing that pisses me off the most is they still think that we're all looking for a handout.
Yeah, that's
We're all
probably
sitting on our ass waiting for the government to come in and do it and give us a handout.
Especially when I rebuilt my house myself. I didn't get a penny from my parents. I didn't get a penny from my friends. I certainly didn't get a penny from the government.
What happened with the storm was that the pervasive, endemic poverty was exposed. And I think that it presented a view that was misconstrued.
We had gutted over 3,000 houses, businesses, and churches here in the 9th Ward. And now it's been the rebuilding for the past 2.5 years.
I don't know who these people are that believe that people in New Orleans are sitting on their butts. There are clearly people who are sitting on their butts watching the news, and they've never been down here seeing people work every day.
The Corps of Engineers were claiming that the surge was so high it came over these walls and eroded the bottom, and that's why they failed, and therefore it wasn't their fault. But what we soon discovered was that the surge only got to about here. It never got to the top of the wall.
On the 17th Street Canal, you can see that the 6-foot wall is gone, and you can see the water pouring through. So the water is continuing to rise.
I see a collapsed house, but that house won't be much longer.
Putting 2 and 2 together, there's no evidence of overtopping. The models show that there wasn't overtopping, yet we had catastrophic failure. It must have been a structural issue. It must have been an engineering design issue.
We were digging in it, we were sampling it, we were testing it, we were doing all that we could to understand why the soil, why the flood protection system had performed so poorly.
The London Avenue breach at Miraboo, the flood walls had totally disappeared. There was a hole about 30 feet deep and sand everywhere. This was sand 6 feet high. White, white, white beach sand. Now we know sand is about the worst material that you can utilize to build a levee because it doesn't have strength, and also because it's permeable. Imagine a bunch of marbles sitting on each other, lots of gaps. The water can move through very easily. At London Avenue, as I looked at those flood walls and I looked at all the sand, I questioned myself as to whether the Corps of Engineers, in designing the system, had taken into account that there was sand beneath the flood wall.
The thing to look at more carefully is the piece of embankment over here, which is open like a hinge on a door, and from here to here has slid laterally about 52 feet. That's not how we like levees to perform.
The breaches had occurred due to water working its way under the sheet piling. That sheet piling had been driven to insufficient penetration. That water acted to weaken the soils, and the walls collapsed into the weak areas.
This is a more serious breach than in the other.
Oh, yeah. There would obviously be no oversight of the Corps of Engineers and their operations. And as we dug deeper, we found clerical errors, we found misinterpretation of data, miscribing data as we look from breach to breach. The kind of mistake at the London Avenue breach is what you learn about in second-year engineering.
There was one contractor who, in fact, went to court because he did not believe the flood wall he was building could hold in front of the storm, and he wanted the Corps to do it right.
The contractor, Pittman Construction, told the Corps of Engineers that the soil and the foundation for the walls were not of sufficient strength, rigidity, and stability.
He went to court. The Corps fought him and won, and he was compelled to build as designed, which he did, and it failed.
There was a lot of denial from the Corps of Engineers.
The conflicts were what we hoped or wished had happened versus what actually did happen.
We heard towards the end of October that there was going to be a press conference.
We had a meeting in the hotel the night before the press conference.
We spent 4 hours late into the night arguing that the integrity of the independent investigations would be questioned. In the end, a Corps official put his foot down. If we did not all play ball, then the further planned fieldwork of the Week 2 teams would be canceled. a direct threat to the two investigations.
What points can we gain access to?
We noticed starting about April of 2006 that we were having some difficulty getting to sites. I got stopped one day at 17th Street and they wouldn't let me go on down to do my work.
We're not hiding anything. We need people to help us, and we will accept any outside, whether they're universities or other government agencies, coming in to help us.
The guys from Berkeley also were having problems, and then the Corps of Engineers started to erect fences around the site. The Berkeley fellas were blocked from 17th Street, and the Attorney General sent one of these lead attorneys down with bolt cutters. He was going to cut the locks, and he was going to declare it a crime scene, and then the Corps of Engineers wouldn't have access anymore.
So you're not discouraging scientists from doing their work?
Not at all, absolutely not at all.
After a number of these sorts of incidents, the State Attorney General sent armed agents with us as we went to the sites.
The explanations that we were bringing forward were counter to the early explanations that had been brought forward by the Corps of Engineers, so that there was that immediate conflict.
And we subsequently heard that the head office of the American Society of Civil Engineers was trying to dictate to these engineers what had gone wrong. And so they were going to release a very weak press release.
We were being told that we couldn't tell the public what we thought had happened. One of my friends from the Netherlands, he wrote on a piece of paper a note to me, passed it to me like we used to do in high school. The note said, "This is a cover-up."
Once again, let's ask a New Orleanian. Why don't they move New Orleans further away from the coast?
Well, it's a nice idea, but it sort of conflicts with reality.
The idea that you could move New Orleans is totally antithetical to that sense of place.
Exactly.
It is here.
How do you pick up St. Louis Cathedral and Ursuline Convent and all
The
of these,
French Quarter.
The French Quarter, like anything. Mid-City, Tremé, the Ninth Ward.
No matter how hard you try, you'd never duplicate my 120-year-old home.
You can't pick up those buildings and move them.
It's the port. Period.
Asked and answered.
Period. That's why you shouldn't move New Orleans.
The more we ran these pumps, the more they failed. When I would bring up the issues to higher command levels that we have problems, I was constantly being corrected by the contractor, who would call New Orleans personnel and state that they thought those requirements were too stringent, saying, "No, we're fine, everything is fine, we know what we're doing." These types of assurances were false to me and hollow. They weren't based in any real type of technical expertise or know-how. Because none of the testing went as planned, and a contractor was not addressing these in a manner that was reasonably suitable, I was asked to not leave until we actually had a successful test. Well, we never had a successful test, so I simply asked to return to Los Angeles because I was useless.
What are you seeing there? I'm just looking at the failure between the rebar.
We would come forward with diagnoses of failures.
One of our suspicions is that scour was more severe.
And the sparring would start from the Corps. They'd have another diagnosis and essentially say we're wrong. This sort of obstructionism, withholding information, attempts to prevent us from accessing the 17th Street, for example, defaming, dishonoring, and discarding, was a very pervasive element of the early days of our investigation.
all of the Army Corps people on site at the testing facility, they were not at any point to engage the contractor or to interfere. We're simply there to observe and report back. I put together all the testing documents that we had. I put together all of the failures that we documented, and then I summarized for the contracting officer and for the commanding colonel at that time, Colonel Setliff, that he now is in possession of defective pumping equipment.
The Corps hired a public relations company to help them put some spin on what they were releasing, trying to discredit any of our outputs, and then to try and get experts jealous of each other or, upset at each other, which of course didn't work.
If you have pumps that won't work, which these don't, you're approaching June 1st, and you realize that the prospect of no pumps means zero pumping capacity. The prospect of putting pumps that have design defects in means you might get a bucket full here and there. For how long, you don't know, but you at least have capacity. You have some capacity. So if you're in the public eye,
Lake Pontchartrain. In front of I thought the water came this way.
if you're getting beaten to death every time you go before the public,
Breakthroughs along there that the water.
it's pretty attractive
Every time we go to these meetings, the date is pushed back.
to make it all sound okay.
Orleans, East, Lake Pontchartrain.
And I think to some extent that had something to do with it.
When Hurricane Betsy came in 1965, when Hurricane Camille came in 1969, those were major hurricanes. They made the river flow backwards. By some measurements, both of them were bigger hurricanes or worse hurricanes, more intense hurricanes, than Katrina. But Betsy flooded 20% of the city, and after we built higher, stronger flood walls, Katrina flooded 80% of the city. Something happened in that 40 years in between.
Hurricane Andrew made landfall in Louisiana in 1992, and its path came up the central part of Louisiana where we have extremely healthy wetlands. So in terms of the wind between the coast and Morgan City, which was some 20-odd miles inland, the wind lost 50% of its energy. And that is an example of how valuable those wetlands are in reducing hurricane impacts, both wind and surge.
We call them wetlands because they absorb and they store water. So the more wetlands you have surrounding a city like New Orleans, the more opportunities you have to keep those storm surges piling up harmlessly offshore instead of encroaching your metropolis.
When a hurricane hits a cypress swamp, it's like a sponge. It just sucks it right up. I mean, there's no better protection from storms than this. Right now, we're sitting in the middle of a swamp in Slidell, Louisiana, right on the edge of the Pearl River right here. And you see it's a beautiful spot, man. Love it. I'm looking for crawfish right now.
You could think of the Mississippi being so enormous and carrying such a sediment load that when it hits the sea, it actually wins the battle. Tides and currents want to sweep away that sediment. The river is so immense that it actually wins that battle, and that's why southeastern Louisiana protrudes into the Gulf of Mexico.
So all of this stuff was built by the Mississippi, and it's supposed to continue to build out.
We started questioning that basic premise and started measuring old maps and aerial photographs, and to our amazement discovered that the coast was no longer building. In fact, for the last, since about the 1930s, it had started retreating.
When you put levees along the river to keep the river in check, it's not spilling off into the tributaries anymore.
This open water that looks like, unfortunately, a bit of a graveyard now, used to be a very vibrant cypress swamp. If you could imagine trees behind me that were 30, 40, maybe even 50 feet high. And unfortunately, because of the changes of the coast, because salt water has encroached, has come in much closer to areas than it used to be, this cypress swamp is no longer in existence. It's open water. And that is what has happened to much of coastal Louisiana. That's why New Orleans, this area that I grew up in as a kid, that used to be an inland city, is now a coastal city and very, very vulnerable. This coast that was built over literally thousands and thousands of years was destroyed in less than 100.
On the coast where the waters rise, a way of life slowly dies. Oh, damn country, let us down. We're all about to drown. That flag is ours too. You know we trusted you. There's nothing left to say. You just turned away.
The swamps I grew up in are gone. When you feel your entire history being wiped away, I think it really hits to a place in your heart that you didn't know you had.
It's phenomenal, the amount of land that's been lost. I mean, the entire state of Rhode Island, nearly the entire state of Delaware, that size is gone.
Coastal wetlands were home to probably the most effective barrier against hurricane storm surges ever invented, namely cypress trees. After Hurricane Andrew, I noticed that although a lot of trees had just snapped like matchsticks, you could go into an area where there were cypress trees and you could hardly tell that anything had come through.
It's amazing to me that we've gone from growing this state, or the accretion of land to the tune of 1 square mile a year, to flipping that to the loss of 40 square miles a year.
It's an acre every hour. You know, I mean, can you imagine losing an acre of land every hour to open water?
If you snake down the Mississippi River, it's going to be 120 miles. But if you get up in an airplane from where we are right now, it's less than 5 nautical miles to the open waters of Lake Bourne, the Mississippi Sound, and the Gulf of Mexico. I mean, it is literally around the corner now.
The window of time in which we have to turn around coastal restoration at a pace faster than the sea is rising and the coast is eroding, it's as short as a decade or two, okay? Well within a generation.
New York's built on a rock. As sea level rises, there's not much you can do about it except move. But the marsh, since it's alive, can actually adjust to sea level rise. If you give the marsh enough sediment and enough fresh water, then the marsh will actually rise with sea level. It will grow.
In 2007, Congress authorized 18 restoration projects totaling $6 to $8 billion. And it said straight out, the Secretary of the Army shall do this by this date. The Corps of Engineers has not turned the first piece of dirt, and approximately 15 deadlines have passed. And these aren't just deadlines where somebody does a study. These are deadlines that are actually the linchpin to these projects advancing. I regret that the law did not provide consequences for missing those deadlines, as is the case whenever we break the law.
We're talking a geological phenomena here occurring well within human lifespans.
For most of its history, New Orleans was afraid of flooding from the Mississippi River. The Corps of Engineers built levees to control the river and pretty much took care of that danger. Today, the fear of flooding in New Orleans is related to a very different source.
As this investigatory process went on, and as it became clearer that they are in possession of defective pumps that aren't going to work when you need them during a hurricane event, the interim closure structures with installed pumps morphed from being a 50-year lifespan into a 3 to 5 year lifespan.
They performed very well since they've been constructed, but they were constructed with a very limited design life.
These were intended to be interim. As you can see, there's no look of permanency. While they're very large and massive, they don't have the life, the useful life that you'd see in a more permanent structure.
Roughly, what has been spent to this point is somewhere between $700 and $800 million, and it's likely more than that.
The Corps did fast-tracked what I call a temporary system, though it's so massive it's hard to believe it's temporary.
Karen Durham-Aguilera is director of Task Force Hope here in New Orleans. That means she's in charge of the entire construction project of the new hurricane risk reduction system, as it's called. She talked to us for this film only on condition we did not discuss the past, just the Corps' present work.
Everything we did on this system, both the interim system as well as all of this work of this nearly $15 billion program that we're building, we didn't do a benefit cost ratio.
The interim gated closure structures with installed pumps was authorized and funded by Congress with the understanding that these pumps had a 50-year lifespan. Embedded in the document is an economic analysis where it's clearly specified that these pumps and this project would cost a particular amount, had a lifespan of 50 years, and a corresponding benefit to cost ratio of 7.3 to 1.
There was an emergency, a disaster had occurred, so we were charged by Congress to get a system in place that had a 1% chance of protecting Greater New Orleans, and that is what we did.
By May the 14th, 2006, we delivered the National Science Foundation-sponsored study.
The Team Louisiana report was released in January of 2007.
The New Orleans Hurricane Protection System was managed like a circa 1965 flood control museum. Design assumptions and policy made in 1965 continue to diminish the system today.
Local officials were all too ready to believe glib assurances from the nation's premier civil engineering organization that they were well protected against 100-year hurricane flooding.
Design histories for the hurricane protection system showed a pervasive trend over time toward substitution of less reliable structures for more conservative designs.
The New Orleans Corps District was one of the first agencies to directly map coastal wetland loss in Louisiana. But this was never incorporated into design philosophies.
Instead of the required analysis, design memoranda for the New Orleans East and Chalmette levees substitute the following disclaimer. Due to the short duration of hurricane flood stages, no erosion protection is considered necessary on the levee slopes.
Where higher-level reviewers identified potential problems, they were rebuffed by New Orleans district personnel, citing professional judgment.
The Corps appeared to accept the hurricane protection system's inadequacy, with a complacency that undercut efforts to sound alarms and begin pressing for improvement.
An analysis of all factors affecting levee elevation is part of FEMA requirements. It is inexcusable this was not done for the most critical urban coastal protection project in the country.
Design procedures and standards employed for many elements of the flood protection system can be traced back to those intended for protection of largely unpopulated agrarian land, not a major urban region. Design levels of safety and reliability were nowhere near those generally used for major dams, because dams are considered to pose a potential risk to large populations.
Both failures at the west edge of the 9th Ward were due to underseepage. Like many sections of the flood protection system, these sheet piles were too shallow to cut off these underseepage flows.
The catastrophic erosion of these two critical levees at the Mr. Go need not have occurred. They could instead have been constructed using well-compacted clay with good resistance to erosion, and they could have been armored.
A large number of engineering errors and poor judgments call into question the integrity and reliability of other sections of the flood protection system that did not fail during this event.
Well, there were several lessons learned, and they're really all identified in the IPET report, which was put together by really an independent group from across the nation.
To add credibility to the IPET report, the American Society of Civil Engineers would provide an external review panel. The whole process was set up to be a very narrow track along which the train would run. The American Society of Civil Engineers would be paid $2 million for its part in this.
They took an objective view of what was here on the ground and how well things performed during Katrina.
That might have been construed as a potential conflict of interest, but as it turned out, that would have been to significantly understate the matter.
The levees were designed with a 1959 definition of something called a standard project hurricane. And it used winds that were only 100 miles an hour. Now, before most of the levees were even designed, that definition was revised by the National Weather Service to be a Category 4 hurricane, 140 mile an hour winds, by 1979.
The standard project hurricane model excluded storms that were deemed to be inordinately severe. In many cases, even though very inexpensive defenses could have been provided for the surges exceeding those of the standard project hurricane, these defenses were not provided.
The area where the levee breaks occurred was at its final design configuration, so that was as good as it was going to get.
The New Orleans District Court never revised the original standard project hurricane-based analysis to reflect the new understanding of the threats, even after being ordered to do so by the Chief of Engineers in 1981.
The design of those walls were based upon a standard hurricane coming through. The Hurricane Katrina was much larger than what the walls were designed for.
In many locations, levees were built at 10 feet when they should have been at 14 feet. They had new model data available to them from 1979 onwards that they ignored.
The intensity of this storm simply exceeded the design capacity of this levee.
The project is designed to protect against the standard project hurricane moving on the most critical track. Only a combination of circumstances anomalous to the region could produce higher stages. The probability of such a combination occurring is, for all practical purposes, nil.
This was not a natural disaster. In fact, this was a very unnatural disaster. This was a disaster caused by people. Following the release of our report, we've had 3 things coming back. Attaboy, go for it, keep it up. The other one, deadly silence. And the third one, please shut up.
Why build a city in a bowl below sea level?
50% of the terrain, both in the city proper and in the metropolis south of the lake, is above sea level, and 50% is below sea level.
John Barry, who wrote Rising Tide, gave the best answer. He said, there's not a deltaic port city on the planet that isn't at or below sea level. 30% of the nation's energy either is pulled from or comes ashore across South Louisiana.
That is very true.
Without New Orleans and South Louisiana, Detroit and pretty much everything within 1,000 miles of it would freeze every winter in the dark.
It's been sobering for us, but really this is the first time that the Corps of Engineers has had to stand up and say, we had a catastrophic failure of one of our projects.
In 2000, I was a reporter at the Washington Post. I had just started an investigative beat, and I was writing about crop insurance. And somebody said to me, you know, crop insurance is the worst thing for America's rivers since the Army Corps of Engineers. I kind of said, what did the Army Corps of Engineers ever do to America's rivers? And I spent most of the year investigating how the Corps was sort of cooking the books of its environmental and economic studies to justify these preposterous boondoggles.
When they were doing their cost-benefit analyses of, what these things were worth, they literally did not include in their equations any value for human life or any value for the sort of geometric progression of a catastrophic event. Had those things been part of the equation, there would have been a lot more investment in the levee system before the storm.
And they really do focus in on, the glories of spline regression techniques and other kinds of things that only somebody who reads unpronounceable statistical journals would ever have any interest in. But that's part of the point, because if your smoke is thicker than the other guy's smoke, then it can look like you really know what you're doing.
The majority of the Corps budget is military projects for the U.S. military. And there, the Corps has really been relatively uncontroversial. They have a client, and they seem to do pretty good work for that client. The controversy has involved their civil works project. The Army Corps is really Capitol Hill's favorite agency because water projects are like the grease that makes Congress go. Every member of Congress loves a water project in his district. It's a way to steer jobs and money to their constituents and their contributors. The Corps is the only agency that's funded just about entirely by earmarks, the sort of classic definition of pork.
There are some splendid engineers in the Corps of Engineers, people that have deep insight, deep knowledge, deep experience, only they're outnumbered. There's not enough of them.
The Corps of Engineers is struggling right now to repair failures in the New Orleans area, and it's painfully clear to our investigation team that they're struggling for lack of technical manpower.
A career Corps engineer said, Bob, the Corps of Engineers are not like it was back in the 1950s when you and your father were with us. In the time since you've been here, we have taken engineering out of the Corps of Engineers. The Corps became project managers, and you can't manage what you can't understand.
The stunning parallel to us is NASA before the Challenger disaster, and NASA afterwards, where they reinstituted their engineering and scientific capabilities at the cost of cost efficiency.
The research that used to feed them, the professional involvement at the technical level in which they used to be leaders, is now absent.
We have strangled the Corps of Engineers in terms of budgets and support. They have responded by doing what was necessary to get their jobs done as best they could.
As bloated and inefficient and wasteful as the Army Corps can be, I'm not sure that in that sense they're quantitatively different than other federal agencies. What really sets them apart is their penchant to do the wrong thing.
The dumbest thing of all, in retrospect, was to build one of the worst pork barrel projects most Americans had never heard of before, which is the Mississippi River-Gulf Outlet, MRGO, which everybody calls Mr. Go. That was the one cut that led to 1,000 deaths.
Construction started in '58 and it was finished in '68.
Prior to that time, the Delta of Louisiana was considered to be kind of a wasteland. The best thing that could possibly be done with it is to dredge it, drain it, and reclaim it.
The growth machine of New Orleans was playing for really big money to build Mr. Go, which is a 75-mile-long ditch.
It was dug in an attempt to bypass the Mississippi River, which can be curvy, tortuous, and it was thought that this would be a big economic boom.
From that first day where cypress forests were dynamited to start the construction of the channel, there was opposition.
And there was a good bit of thought in the 50s before it started from people like Louisiana Fish and Wildlife that, you know, this is not a good idea. This is going to alter the ecology of the area here.
Not only is it allowing a straight route for shipping to go in and out of there, it also allows a straight route for the tide to come in and bring salt water way up into town and start just killing grass and trees and everything like that.
But this is in the 50s. I mean, people don't even know what ecology is in the 50s. And if you told someone in the 50s you were an environmentalist, they wouldn't know what that meant.
In 1972, the first report that we produced was submitted in a public hearing to the Corps of Engineers. It was in that report that we first coined the phrase, the funnel.
The Mr. Go funnel is very simple to understand. You just have to look at a map and look at the V and understand the water's coming up the V, and what's it going to do? It's going to get squished and it's going to rise.
The Corps vehemently denied that this effect would occur. They conducted some mathematical statistical model studies that said that, you know, this would not happen.
The biggest problem is that we're digging through marsh and it's not firm, and so you could dig 35 feet down, but the sides would slump in, and then they would have to go in and re-dig it, and then the sides would slump in more. So there are places where the ship canal, if you want to call it that, is 1/4 of a mile wide just from the slumping sides.
And each time the Corps would go in and dredge it a little bit wider, that would let in more salt water, which would kill more plants, which would create more of a problem. It was a self-feeding disaster.
When Mr. Go was built with a 35-foot depth in 1968, we weren't even building ships with that smaller draft anymore. So it was basically obsolete when it opened. No one really asked the question, is this thing going to be economically sound?
Maybe it would have been good for commerce had it been built right away in 1921, 1923, but by the time it was finished in 68, it was an afterthought.
In the last year of full operation, which was 2004, there were only about 10 round trips by ships that actually needed the water depth for Mr. Go. And the Corps spent about $15 million that year in maintenance dredging. So do the numbers, $1.5 million per trip.
And they were mainly carrying high-value products like scrap metal and frozen chickens. $10,000 per ship mile. We generous American taxpayers poured $580 million into that ditch over the years. Much of that from dredging it again every year. As long as the exercise of cost-benefit analysis makes it look as though building Mr. Go was a net benefit for the economy, then you go ahead and build it. And the people who benefited from that, the people who own the dredging companies, who own the shipbuilding companies, it's a process of concentrating the benefits into the pockets of a few political beneficiaries, spreading the costs to everybody else, and hiding the risks. And in this case, the risks included the fact that people died who didn't have to die.
The Corps first denied that there was any funnel effect and that water coming down this portion of Mr. Go that we're standing beside wasn't what flooded the city. Well, now they're building a multi-billion-dollar wall out there to prevent what they said didn't happen.
In a location that we had identified decades before.
I don't know what you mean by a frontal effect, but it's a barrier to water.
The Mississippi River Gulf Outlet is now decommissioned. A 10,000-foot barrier, almost 2 miles long. The Lake Borgne Surge Barrier is the largest design-build civil works project in the history of the Army Corps of Engineers.
It is more than a wall. It's two 150-foot gates. It's a wall, it's a flood wall, it's barriers, it's really a state of engineering marvel. And it's really unique and one of its kind in the world. There are similar facilities, but we've never done anything like this to this scale in the United States as well as elsewhere.
Mr. Go is here forever. They moved more dirt to build this thing than they did the Panama Canal. It will never be filled. So we have reached the point where we can build projects that are so big that we can't undo them. It'll never be undone.
People want to go forward. They want to change some of these problems. That doesn't mean we can do it by ourselves. My whole premise is that we need information and help from the Dutch. I went to the Dutch and said, I think we haven't quite understood how you've built your place low-lying like this to be a safe place. That was November '06, and then that went forward, goes forward. The premise that the Dutch have is that you try to keep the soil as wet as possible. We don't really want to pump it dry. We actually want to keep it fat. If you dry the soil out, it shrinks because it's soft, organic soil.
That dryness allows the organic matter to decay. This opens up more cavities. The land drops, it compacts, it falls below sea level.
But what you want is to stabilize that groundwater level. If the Corps of Engineers designs the system that they are charged to do, at some point in time with sea level rise, you probably get overtopping of levees. And so you have internal water storage that can take that overtopping, can go somewhere and doesn't go in your front door. We used to have a lot more water in the city. Bayou St. John is a very desirable part of town. Why live in South Louisiana disconnected from the water? In Korea, when they unearth a canal and open up the waterway, the real estate values go up. We gotta move away from just the idea of engineered solutions. We have to get to more passive and natural systems. And how do I create more safety? Well, counterintuitive or not, more water is probably more safety. I remember the mother who said, well, what happens with an open canal? My young kid might drown. And I remember the Dutch response, which was, we teach our children to swim and we have the lowest incidence of drowning.
I got a request from some lawyers to participate as an expert witness in a suit they were proposing against the US government related to the consequences of the Mr. Go construction and the flooding.
I had spent 25 years in New Orleans off and on, and I got a call from some of the leading trial lawyers in Louisiana asking me if I'd come down. As soon as the airport opened after Katrina, met with a half dozen lawyers who wanted to try to do something.
We could show if the Mr. Go had never been built, the Mr. Go levees would never have failed. So the whole of St. Bernard Parish would have been dry.
It's the largest suit ever against the United States of America. They have two unique advantages against you. They make the laws and print the money.
And in our American system of justice, the only thing that you truly can do is that you can file a lawsuit.
And we filed suit in April of 2006 on behalf of 6 victims in New Orleans East, the Lower Ninth Ward, and St. Bernard Parish. The Robinsons' house was under 10, 12 feet of water. Tanya Smith's home was under 15 feet of water. And she rebuilt her home and had a fire that destroyed her home after she rebuilt it, but she rebuilt it again. Kent Lattimore, and he was also under 15 feet of water. The Franzes had 14 feet of water. Some of my clients contemplated suicide. One of them put a gun to his head, but said, no, I want to stay and help raise my granddaughter.
The only place I think we're getting, quote, a fair hearing is in the judicial proceedings that continue.
We were only going to get one bite of the apple. We spent $8 million, the 20 law firms that make up our group, and tens of millions of dollars of donated legal time. If another plaintiff wanted to come after us after we lost, God bless them, but realistically that wouldn't happen. So we knew we had one shot at the king, and we wanted to make sure we were prepared.
The attorneys came to LSU and met with the then LSU Chancellor, Sean O'Keefe, and he told them that if I testified against the Corps of Engineers, if I testified against the federal government, especially given that President Bush was in office, that I would be fired.
We set about the business of trying to contact other experts, and we hit the wall. I can't tell you how many people we spoke to who said to us, we cannot work with you, we cannot talk to you, we cannot associate with you at all.
I turned to my colleagues and said, well, would they serve as expert witnesses for the plaintiffs? And their responses were, Bob, we would like to, but we can't.
It's chilling, because if they don't testify, the trier of fact doesn't hear the truth.
Our team reviewed 4 million pages of historic Army Corps documents, what the Army Corps did with regard to the levees and the Mr. Go beginning in the 1950s.
I think the Corps has always been pretty transparent. They're pretty open in the way they go about not doing the right thing.
In 1988, the Army Corps wrote a report that emphatically and unambiguously said that if we don't do something about the destruction of the wetlands and the widening of the Mr. Go, someday there's going to be a catastrophic flooding of New Orleans. That's precisely what happened. They never heeded this advice, never even heeded their own internal memoranda.
So in this legal story is a story of the hope for prevention in the future. And without that legal story, I would have no hope.
The canons of judicial ethics preclude a judge from commenting on the merits of a case that is pending. The case involving the Mr. Go, I have already decided, but it is still pending because it has been appealed. So I'm simply reading from the opinion that I've already written, which is a matter of record. The Corps' lassitude and failure to fulfill its duties resulted in a catastrophic loss of human life and property in unprecedented proportions. The Corps' negligence resulted in the wasting of millions of dollars in flood protection measures and billions of dollars in congressional outlays to help this region recover from such a catastrophe. By 1988, it knew that indeed all of the engineering blunders that it made now put the parish of St. Bernard at risk, despite the existence of a levee which it had spent money to construct. The Corps cannot mask these failures with the cloak of policy. At some point, simple engineering knowledge, like a wave wake is going to destroy the surrounding habitat and create a hazard, cannot be ignored, and the safety of an entire metropolitan area cannot be compromised.
The Corps is called out all the time because they're not very good at covering their tracks. So there have been plenty of federal judges who have talked about how dysfunctional they are, how recalcitrant they are, how defiant they are.
Well, we value all the constructive criticism we get, and we'll produce a much better product and serve the American people much better when we take a hard look at all the constructive criticism that we get from a wide variety of sources. And we do welcome that because we'll be a better organization as a result of it, and we'll be able to serve the nation and produce a better system here when we take all of that into consideration.
The court finds that the Corps' negligent failure to maintain and operate the Mystico properly was a substantial cause for the fatal breaching of the Reach 2 levee and the subsequent catastrophic flooding of the St. Bernard polder occurred. As to the North Shore, the callous and or myopic approach of the Corps to the obvious deleterious nature of the Mystico is beyond understanding.
I felt after his ruling came out, just for a moment, sorry for the Corps of Engineers, because if you read that ruling, you realize that the Corps of Engineers has absolutely nowhere to hang its hat.
One of the ugliest things to happen in the wake of Katrina has been the apparent campaign of retribution now being exacted against those that crossed the Corps.
I have colleagues that declare me a public enemy. I have colleagues that won't talk to me anymore, but such is the price of standing up.
On the September the 21st of 2005, the Washington Post issued their story about the catastrophic structural failure of the levees, and immediately we noticed a total change in the way we were being treated on campus. Early November of 2005, I had to go to Washington, D.C. to testify before a Senate committee. The University of Berkeley, when their scientist engineer came up to testify before the same committee, they sent their whole public relations team and used it as a launch pad to go out and get $20 million for a new research center. When I came back, LSU called me before two vice chancellors and basically told me to quit talking to the press. This is fairly typical of some of the failures we've seen.
Professor Ivor Van Heerden.
Somebody from LSU had met with Corps of Engineers officials who had complained about me, and I guess the university, for whatever reason, was reacting to that. That was the beginning.
I wrote a declaration of what I believed to be a more truthful statement of what existed out there at these interim gated closure structures. And it was very detailed. And I gave the backup documents to show why I felt the way I did. And I also tried to explain why there's no way these hydraulic pumps will work. There's just no way. There's no way to say such with any engineering certainty. Colonel Beatty was actually giving very optimistic, rather rosy prognosis of how these pumps will operate. He said essentially, these pumps work great. They work fantastic, and you can depend on them.
Well, I attempted to deal with it, and I don't know how well I did or didn't deal with it, but I attempted to deal with it in an open and transparent manner. I tried to put myself in the shoes of the people who had to live through this greatest natural disaster in the history of our country.
And now Maria Garzino attempted to inform her superiors of the defects she was discovering in the pumps. She had no idea what was in store for her.
I tried to determine what was the most expedient way for me to bring this issue forward without having to go another year into a second cycle, which would mean another hurricane season. I contacted Chief Counsel. I initiated an internal investigation. What was causing these failures? Review or something. See that the Army Corps looked further into do it in a timely manner. I started that process. General Creer, the commander of Mississippi Valley. This happened outside of my district. Quote, look into my concerns. These are two different commands. Issues that they brought forward for investigation. Interpreted what my concerns were wholly different than the issues I had asked to be looked into. I'm trying to remember where I went next. The Department of Defense Inspector General, Chief Counsel, Chair of the Government Oversight Committee, a lawyer, very much threatening and intimidating, changing my testimony. Special investigator at the FBI. There were a few things in between. The GAO report had come out also. I had a rather strong response, so it's like a non-investigation. It was a disgrace. I never heard back from them on that. I was very concerned at that time. The people of New Orleans, God help us if a hurricane came. The moment, literally the day after, I filed a report, a disclosure with the U.S. Office of Special Counsel, and someone inside the Pentagon had decided that they would leak this document to the press. And it was once the document was leaked that I received the phone call from Chief Counsel at Sacramento, where she told me essentially that headquarters felt that I had gone outside my chain of command, and they were very displeased with me.
I was the golden boy at LSU, and immediately that changed. I knew if we got into this, we were going to have a big fight, and that we could lose our jobs. And I asked my wife if she was willing to take that chance of me losing my job for us to do this. And she said it was fine.
By filing a disclosure through the U.S. Office of Special Counsel, I become a whistleblower. So there are certain protections that are afforded me by doing that. How valid they are or effective they are, I think is in question. I can't think of many people that would say that that is a protection that one should feel totally comfortable with.
We wouldn't toe the line. We wouldn't keep quiet. We'd continue to speak out. They weren't happy about it. They weren't happy about all the media requests. They weren't happy about the documentaries.
In an effort to bring accountability and a better resolution, hopefully, to this process, the U.S. Office of Special Counsel had gone out on their own and hired their own outside independent engineer, Aparic. They do not do work for the Army Corps. They are not connected to the Army Corps or DOD. And the individual, Gil Lucas, is a true expert in hydraulics and in pumps. They were to review all the documents that were ever submitted by me in the past, as well as additional materials. They were to make their own conclusions and provide back to OSC their own findings. Mr. Lucas concurred that not only were all of my allegations founded, that they had significant merit, but he even interjected that they were possibly somewhat understated. He, in addition, uncovered additional, more serious even, design deficiencies with the hydraulic pumping equipment. He submitted his report, all of his findings, to OSC, and OSC concurred with Aparic, Mr. Lucas's findings, and submitted a letter of findings to the President and also the House and Senate Oversight Committees. So it was June of 2009. There has been no response.
I'm not going to comment on the Office of Special Counsel and the Department of Defense, but I will tell you that there have been numerous internal reviews of the work, external reviews of the work, audits and so forth. The reality is we got a system in there as quickly as we could to protect the community, and it works.
One of the darkest examples of apparent retribution has been the effort to terminate the employment of Dr. Ivor Van Heerden and two of his colleagues at the Louisiana Hurricane Research Center in retaliation for their leading roles in the state of Louisiana's independent investigation.
They took away my right to teach, took away my right to administer big projects, cut me to 1-year contract renewals. The LSU Hurricane Center no longer exists. The LSU Hurricane Public Health Center no longer exists. Everybody who was part of Team Louisiana no longer works at LSU.
My health is in the toilet. I've gained 40 pounds. Those bikes you see up there, I used to ride them 100 miles in one shot. What was very comforting, if I should say it like that, was we now had answers. We now knew why. We had engineering, we had concrete reasons, engineering reasons why these systems were failing. And if anyone thinks that they're going to make it through an actual hurricane event, that's not possible. And now we've proven that.
When they couldn't get my own faculty to get rid of me, they made the decision to terminate my position. What was very insulting is they couldn't tell me why. You know, I felt like a good pair of shoes just being cast off.
At a recent national conference of the American Society of Civil Engineers, I was called publicly by a colleague as an enemy of the United States. That's painful.
My career with the Corps, fundamentally, it's pretty much over. It's been over for quite a while. I've had any meaningful work was stripped years ago, at the start of this process, actually. And it's only snowballed into as complete a stripping as you can possibly get. I am currently still employed with the Corps, and I'm deeply grateful to have a job, but I miss having a real job.
So some rather unpleasant consequences for the people who had gone public with what they learned about the disaster. What about the people who were present at the creation of the mistakes that led to the flooding? Were there any negative career consequences for them?
You know, I really, because of the time that I was involved with the effort, became involved with the effort down here, I'm not really aware of any of the details associated with that at this time.
Not that I'm aware of, and when I said that I was fairly certain mistakes were made, I said that in the context of we're human and people make mistakes, and you know, it's really easy to sit back on Monday morning and armchair quarterback a football game.
And that's been pretty consistent in Corps history. It's an agency that's always failed upwards. When its most catastrophic failures have been sort of growth opportunities.
After 53 years, if I build something and it falls down, I don't care about a lawyer or a law, I am liable.
There have been generally no consequences for this catastrophic failure.
Well, we want to ensure that folks are accountable and responsible for their actions.
I have no doubt that heads should roll. The fact that Ivor's is the head that seems to be rolling is the height of irony.
The president of LSU has also recently reportedly received $12 million to help the Corps to prioritize its projects. The argument can be made that this represents payment of $12 million to do a job that does not exist, and for which LSU would not be qualified anyway. The invitation to perceive that as potential payment for the retaliatory firing of Dr. Van Heerden and his colleagues would then be great indeed.
I'm a state employee. I'm paid by the state of Louisiana. I felt it was my state duty to do the research and to do the investigations that I felt were necessary. Why else was I being funded by the state of Louisiana? So it's very hard to bear. Sometimes there's 2 o'clock in the morning, you wake up and you ask yourself, why? What did I do wrong?
Isn't New Orleans just a depopulated, Disney-fied version of its former self?
I reject the notion of there being an authentic and an inauthentic New Orleans. I think it's all real. If you look back in history, there was always newness coming in that was seen as a threat to the way things were.
Happy Mardi Gras, planet Earth!
This is one of the few places where culture doesn't come down from above, and it's not this rich classical high-end culture. It's culture that comes from the Caribbean and Africa and Spain and France and America.
And I don't believe in authenticity or inauthenticity. To me, it's all real. The 7th Ward is real, Gentilly's real, Bourbon Street is real, the bad restaurants are real, the good restaurants are real.
I think residents' attitude just flipped a switch after the flood. We used to denigrate our city big time, and now we're so totally in love, and we have reason to be.
I'm up, I'm out of bed, I'm standing on the street watching a second line. I'm going to Mardi Gras Indian parades. I'm gonna hold on to it and never let go. Yeah, and I'm never leaving.
Yeah, I think there's more focus now on the culture. I ain't never leaving. Katrina sealed that for me. If I ever thought about leaving, Katrina sealed that.
The Army Corps builds incompetent levees in New Orleans, and Congress says, here's 10 or 20 billion, go fix your mistakes.
It's going to be very difficult to change the culture of that agency.
The Army Corps destroys wetlands, and then Congress says, here's some money to go fix them up.
Whether we like it or not, it was political. Now, I don't say political in a negative sense, just it was political.
Congressmen and women and senators want Army Corps projects in their districts. They want to bring home the bacon.
It's part of how our government works. This work is civil works. It is appropriated annually by the Congress of the United States.
Who puts those members of Congress there? The contractors who get billions of dollars of Corps contracts give away millions of dollars of campaign contributions to the Congress.
They appropriate based upon federal budgets, and things are negotiated, and decisions are made, and they're not easy decisions, but that's what we elect our representatives and our president to do.
Every president of the United States since Franklin Delano Roosevelt, right up through George Bush, has attempted to rein in and reform the Army Corps of Engineers. It just has not happened.
We're still having a great deal of trouble seeing the important institutional behavioral changes that have to happen out on the levee, so to speak, to make sure that this time when we get a protective system in place, it's something that all of us can rely on.
David Wagoner and his Dutch associates have come up with an entirely different vision.
Dutch Dialogue 3 brought in another 20 or so Dutch professionals. Worked for 3 days on the area between the London Avenue and Orleans Avenue canals. We looked at creating a water system. You know, to talk only about drainage says I'm going to solve that one problem, but you aren't looking at how you can create value. Moving consciously to a biological model and not an engineering-based model, there needs to be an integrated program. It's not as simple as saying the Corps of Engineers is going to have to fix it all and just get rid of the water, because the first premise is you store water where it falls. If you don't get this foundational level right, if you don't get this underlying strata right, if you don't have a strategy to deal with the flooding and the water, all your investments are bad.
In December 2009, I received notification from OSC that they had selected me for Public Servant of the Year. I was grateful for it on a number of levels.
This is not about me, it's more about justice and making sure that this doesn't happen to others down the line. Scientists must be allowed in academic situations to follow the leads where the leads take them and be able to present their data freely and openly to the public, to the scientific community. Thank you.
It's not all fun, it's not all games. If I have to take a few bad hits at the end of my career, I can and will take it.
One of the things that I have had faith in personally is the Corps' I don't think they want to be embarrassed again. So I think they're going to do everything in their power to make sure that we don't have this happen to us. We spend more time focused on getting our community back up and running, and the people who are being paid millions of dollars to make sure that those levees don't break again, we have faith that they'll do that they'll protect us.
One of the best things that's happened after Katrina is this. New Orleans it's got great people, it's got a great character, great culture, and there is a unity around here that it's never been here in my lifetime. This place is worth saving, and we can do it. And yes, I'm betting we're going to do it.
It's always been. It's gonna be a game. They're never gonna stop the party, and they never gonna stop New Orleans. They got people in New Orleans from close every place. It's a funky microcosm of the human race. I really like it like that. So tell me where y'all at. They never stop the pot from melting, and they never gonna stop New Orleans. Cajun spice, jambalaya, etouffee, red beans and rice. I love all that stuff. Man, I never get enough. They're never gonna close the kitchen, and they never gonna stop New Orleans. A whole lot of music that I love to play. They brought it up to Mississippi from New Orleans, LA, River Nat, Toussaint, Domino, long hair, Marcellus Booker, Connie, jelly rolls from there. They're never gonna stop the music, and they never gonna stop New Orleans. They're never gonna close the kitchen, and they never gonna stop New Orleans. They're never gonna stop the party, and they never gonna stop New Orleans.
They said things down here were bound to change, and I said, never count your chickens, for the cracks begin to show. So we live in plague and party, common fright, knowing those little pills will remain on the bedside table